The desert sun beat down mercilessly on the cracked earth of Bitter Creek Ranch as Clara May Henderson stood in the shadow of her grandfather's weathered barn, clutching a rusted iron box that contained secrets worth more than she had ever imagined. Inside lay a hand-drawn map marked with an X, Spanish silver coins blackened with age, and a letter that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's past and the legendary outlaw Jesse James. But this story begins 6 months earlier, when Clara May thought the worst thing that could happen was losing the ranch to foreclosure. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and if this story grips you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have something truly extraordinary waiting for you. The morning mist hung low over the rolling hills of Montana Territory as Clara May Henderson guided her horse along the familiar trail that led to what had been the Henderson family ranch for 3 generations. At 26, she possessed the kind of weathered beauty that came from years of honest work under the big sky, her auburn hair catching the early light as it escaped from beneath her worn felt hat. Her calloused hands gripped the reins with the confidence of someone who had been riding these trails since she could barely walk, but today those same hands trembled slightly with anticipation and dread. The telegram from the lawyer in Helena had been brief and formal, informing her of her grandfather Ezekiel Henderson's death and her unexpected inheritance of the Bitter Creek Ranch. Clara May had not seen the old man in 5 years. Not since the bitter argument that had driven her away from Montana to try her luck in San Francisco. She had left as a headstrong 21-year-old, convinced that the modern world of 1887 had no place for the isolated life of cattle ranching. Now she was returning as a woman who had learned hard lessons about survival in a world that showed little mercy to those without connections or inherited wealth. San Francisco had promised adventure and opportunity, but it had delivered mainly disappointment and struggle. Clara May had worked as a seamstress in a factory where the hours were long and the pay barely covered her rent in a cramped boarding house. She had written letters home sporadically, her pride preventing her from admitting how difficult life had become in the city. Her grandfather had replied occasionally, his careful penmanship revealing little of his feelings about her departure or his hopes for her return. The ranch house came into view as Clara May crested the final hill, and she felt her breath catch. At the sight of the place that had shaped her childhood, the 2-story log structure stood solid and imposing against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains, its wide porch wrapping around 3 sides and offering views of the valley that stretched toward the distant peaks. Smoke rose from the chimney, indicating that someone was maintaining the property, and Clara May felt a pang of gratitude toward whoever had been caring for her grandfather's home in his final days. Ezekiel Henderson had been a man of mystery and few words, known throughout the territory as someone who minded his own business and expected others to do the same. He had arrived in Montana in the late 1860s with enough money to buy substantial acreage and the livestock to stock it. But he had never spoken about his life before coming west. Clara May's grandmother had died when Clara May was too young to remember her, and her own parents had been killed in a wagon accident when she was 12, leaving her to be raised by the taciturn old rancher who seemed more comfortable with cattle than with children. Despite his gruff exterior, Ezekiel had taught Clara May everything about ranching that a person could learn. She could rope and brand cattle, repair fences, manage the books, and make the difficult decisions about buying and selling livestock that determined whether a ranch prospered or failed. But he had also instilled in her a sense of independence and self-reliance that made it impossible for her to accept the limitations that frontier society placed on women. When she had announced her intention to leave for San Francisco, Ezekiel had said nothing, but Clara May had seen something in his eyes that might have been disappointment or might have been understanding. now dismounting in front of the house, where she had been raised. Clara May felt the weight of years and regret pressing down upon her. She had been too proud to return while her grandfather was alive, too stubborn to admit that her dreams of city life had been naive and unrealistic. The key was where it had always been, hidden under the loose board on the porch steps, and Clara May let herself into the house that smelled of tobacco, leather, and the indefinable scent of home. The interior was exactly as she remembered it, from the massive stone fireplace that dominated the main room to the kitchen where her grandfather had taught her to cook simple but satisfying meals. His presence seemed to linger in every corner, and Clara May found herself listening for the sound of his boots on the wooden floors or his voice calling her name. On the kitchen table, she found a note in his familiar handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Clara May, if you are reading this, then the Lord has seen fit to call me home, and you have found your way back to Bitter Creek Ranch. I know there were hard words between us when you left, and I regret that pride kept me from telling you that I understood your need to see the world beyond these mountains. This ranch and everything on it is yours now, along with some things you will discover that I never had the courage to tell you about while I was alive. Look for the truth in the place where we used to watch the sunset together. Your grandfather, who loved you more than his own life, Ezekiel Henderson. Tears blurred Clara May's vision as she read the letter that contained more emotion than her grandfather had ever expressed in person. The place where they used to watch the sunset together was the old oak tree on the hill behind the house, where Ezekiel had often taken her in the evenings to talk about the ranch, the weather, and occasionally about life in general. Clara May folded the letter carefully and slipped it into her jacket pocket before walking out to the tree that had been a constant presence throughout her childhood. The oak was ancient and gnarled, its massive trunk scarred by decades of harsh weather and its branches spreading wide enough to provide shade for several horses. Clara May had climbed this tree countless times as a child, and she knew every knot and hollow in its bark. Following her grandfather's cryptic instruction to look for the truth, she began examining the base of the tree more carefully than she ever had before. What she found changed everything she thought she knew about Ezekiel Henderson and the source of his wealth. Hidden in a hollow at the base of the oak, carefully wrapped in oiled canvas, was the iron box that would reveal secrets about her family's connection to one of the most notorious outlaw gangs in American history. The box was heavy and secured with a rusted padlock that yielded to the pressure of a rock after several attempts. Inside, Clara May discovered items that made her hands shake and her heart race with a mixture of excitement and fear. The first thing she pulled from the box was a leather pouch containing more than 50 silver coins, each one bearing Spanish markings and clearly dating from an earlier era. The coins were tarnished black with age, but Clara May could see that they were genuine silver and probably worth far more than their weight in precious metal. Beneath the coins was a folded piece of paper that proved to be a hand-drawn map showing the location of what appeared to be a cave system in the mountains east of the ranch. But it was the letter at the bottom of the box that truly shocked Clara May and forced her to reconsider everything she thought she knew about her grandfather's past. Written in Ezekiel's careful handwriting, but clearly composed many years earlier based on the faded ink and yellowed paper, the letter was addressed to her and began with words that changed her understanding of her family's history forever. My dear granddaughter, if you are reading this letter, then I am beyond the reach of earthly justice, and you have inherited more than just a cattle ranch. I need to tell you the truth about how I came to Montana and why I was able to purchase this land when I was barely 30 years old. The money did not come from honest work or careful saving. It came from my association with men whose names you will recognize from newspaper accounts and dime novels, men who robbed banks and trains and were hunted by law enforcement across half the country. Clara May's hands trembled as she continued reading her grandfather's confession to crimes that had taken place before she was born. He wrote about his involvement with Jesse James, Frank James, and other members of the notorious gang that had terrorized the border states during and after the Civil War. According to Ezekiel's account, he had not been one of the primary members of the gang, but rather someone who had provided safe haven and assistance when the outlaws needed to disappear from pursuing law enforcement. The ranch, he explained, had been purchased with money from a train robbery that had taken place in 1868, just months before he had arrived in Montana Territory. But more shocking still was his revelation that a significant portion of the stolen silver had been hidden in a cave system on the ranch property, waiting for a time when it would be safe to retrieve and spend. The map in the box showed the location of this cache, along with detailed instructions for finding the entrance to the caves where the treasure had been concealed for nearly 20 years. Ezekiel's letter went on to explain his reasons for never retrieving the hidden silver despite the financial security it would have provided. He had been haunted by the knowledge that the money represented the suffering of innocent people who had been robbed and terrorized by the James gang. As the years passed, and he built a legitimate life as a rancher, he had found it increasingly difficult to justify claiming wealth that had been stolen from others. But he had also been unable to return the money to its rightful owners, partly because he feared prosecution and partly because he genuinely did not know how to make such restitution. Now, he wrote, the decision about what to do with the hidden treasure would fall to Clara May. She could retrieve the silver and use it to secure the ranch's future, ensuring that the Henderson family legacy would continue for generations to come. Or she could find a way to return the money to its rightful owners, accepting the financial consequences but living with a clear conscience. Either way, Ezekiel concluded, she would be making the choice that he had been too cowardly to make during his own lifetime. Clara May sat beneath the oak tree as the sun moved across the sky, reading and rereading her grandfather's confession, while struggling to absorb the implications of what she had discovered. The man who had raised her, who had taught her the values of honesty and hard work, had built his entire life on the foundation of stolen money. The ranch that represented her family's heritage and her own potential future had been purchased with the proceeds of robbery and violence. But even more disturbing was the realization that she now faced exactly the kind of moral dilemma that her grandfather had spent 20 years avoiding. The hidden silver could solve every financial problem she faced and provide the resources necessary to make the ranch profitable again. According to the map and Ezekiel's notes, the treasure was substantial enough to pay off any debts, make necessary improvements to the property, and establish a comfortable life for herself and any family she might eventually have. Alternatively, she could attempt to return the money to its rightful owners or their descendants, a process that would likely be complicated, expensive, and potentially dangerous. Even if she could identify the victims of the original robbery, there was no guarantee that they or their families could be located after so many years. And any attempt to return stolen money would inevitably involve questions about how she had come to possess it, potentially exposing her grandfather's criminal past and her own knowledge of crimes that had never been prosecuted. As evening approached, and Clara May finally returned to the ranch house, she found herself facing decisions that would determine not just her own future, but the legacy of the Henderson family name. The silver coins in the leather pouch represented just a fraction of what was apparently hidden in the mountain caves, enough to provide a glimpse of the wealth that could be hers if she chose to claim her grandfather's buried treasure. But as she sat in the kitchen, Where Ezekiel had taught her to cook and count money from cattle sales, Clara May began to understand why her grandfather had never been able to bring himself to retrieve the hidden silver. The knowledge that her comfortable childhood had been built on the suffering of others cast a shadow over every happy memory she had of life at Bitter Creek Ranch. The very foundation of her family's prosperity was tainted with violence and theft, making her inheritance both a blessing and a curse that would haunt whatever decision she ultimately made. The lamp flickered as Clara May examined the Spanish silver coins more closely, noting the craftsmanship and age that made them valuable. Beyond their weight in precious metal, these coins represented history and artistry as well as wealth, and she found herself wondering about their original owners and the circumstances that had brought them into the possession of the James gang. Each coin was a link to a larger story of crime and violence that had shaped the American West, and Clara May realized that she had become an unwilling participant in that story simply by virtue of her inheritance. The summer of 1882 had been the happiest time in Clara May Henderson's young life, when she was 21 and the world seemed full of endless possibilities. She stood now in the same kitchen where she had discovered her grandfather's shocking confession, but her memory transported her back to those golden days when Bitter Creek Ranch represented nothing more complicated than home, family, and the promise of a secure future. That particular summer had begun with the arrival of Daniel Morrison, a young surveyor from the territorial government who had come to update the official maps of property boundaries in their region of Montana. Clara May first encountered him when she was checking fence lines in the North Pasture and found him setting up his surveying equipment near the creek that marked the border between Henderson land and the neighboring Morrison Spread, which belonged to no relation despite the shared surname. Daniel was unlike any man Clara May had ever met, educated and well-traveled, but without the arrogance that often accompanied such advantages. He had grown up in Boston, attended Harvard University, and worked for the Territorial Survey Office in Helena, but he spoke to Clara May as an equal, rather than as a frontier woman whose opinions were automatically dismissed. Their first conversation lasted 3 hours as they sat beside the creek, discussing everything from cattle ranching to the political changes sweeping across the American West. Over the following weeks, Daniel found numerous reasons to return to the Henderson Ranch, ostensibly to complete his surveying work, but actually to spend time with Clara May. They would ride together across the vast grazing lands, with Daniel marveling at the scope of the operation and Clara May enjoying his genuine interest in the practical aspects of ranch management. He asked thoughtful questions about breeding programs, seasonal grazing patterns, and the economic challenges facing cattle ranchers in an increasingly competitive market. Ezekiel Henderson had observed this developing relationship with what appeared to be approval, though he never directly commented on Daniel's frequent visits. The old rancher seemed to appreciate Daniel's respectful manner and genuine interest in learning about ranch operations. During evening meals, when Daniel was invited to stay for dinner, Ezekiel would occasionally share stories about the early days of establishing the ranch, though Clara May noticed that his accounts always began with his arrival in Montana and never mentioned his life before coming west. Clara May had been completely enchanted by Daniel's vision of their future together. He spoke eloquently about the changes coming to the American West, the arrival of railroads that would connect remote ranches to eastern markets, and the opportunities available to people with education, determination, and access to capital. Daniel saw the Henderson Ranch not just as a cattle operation, but as the foundation for a diversified agricultural enterprise that could include farming, timber harvesting, and even mining operations if mineral deposits were discovered on the property. Most importantly to Clara May, Daniel treated her as a partner in these plans, rather than as a woman whose role would be limited to domestic duties. He had seen enough of her work around the ranch to recognize her capabilities, and he spoke naturally about decisions they would make together, improvements they would implement jointly, and the family they would build while expanding the ranch into something even more successful than Ezekiel had created. Their courtship had followed the rhythms of ranch life, with romantic moments interspersed among the practical demands of cattle, horses, and the endless cycle of work required to maintain a successful operation. Clara May remembered dancing with Daniel at the barn, raising for the Thompsons' new place, feeling completely confident that she had found the man she would marry and the life she wanted to live. They had talked about a wedding the following spring, after Daniel completed his current surveying contract and could request a transfer to a position based closer to Bitter Creek Ranch. The engagement ring Daniel had given Clara May was a simple gold band with a small diamond, modest by the standards of wealthy Eastern families, but representing a significant investment for a young government surveyor. Clara May had worn it proudly, showing it to the wives of neighboring ranchers and beginning to plan the kind of wedding celebration that would bring families together from across the territory. She had started sewing her wedding dress during the long winter evenings, working by lamplight, while Ezekiel read aloud from books and newspapers he ordered from Denver and San Francisco. But the happiness of that golden summer had been shattered by events that Clara May could never have anticipated. The trouble began with the arrival of a stranger who introduced himself as Thomas McCarthy, claiming to be a cattle buyer from Chicago, interested in purchasing beef for the eastern markets. McCarthy was a well-dressed man in his 40s, with the kind of smooth manner that immediately put Clara May on guard, though she could not have articulated exactly why she found him unsettling. Ezekiel's reaction to McCarthy had been even more pronounced and troubling. The old rancher, normally courteous to visitors and potential customers, became visibly agitated during McCarthy's visit to the ranch. He answered the supposed cattle buyer's questions in monosyllables, avoided making eye contact, and clearly wanted the man to leave as quickly as possible. When McCarthy finally departed after an uncomfortable hour of stilted conversation, Ezekiel retreated to his study and remained there for the rest of the day, emerging only for a dinner that passed in complete silence. Clara May had tried to question her grandfather about his reaction to McCarthy, but Ezekiel had brushed off her concerns with vague comments about not trusting smooth-talking strangers who made promises that seemed too good to be true. At the time, Clara May had attributed his response to the natural suspicion of an old rancher who had learned to be cautious about business dealings with people he didn't know. She had no way of understanding that McCarthy's visit had awakened fears that Ezekiel had been carrying for nearly 15 years. The real crisis had erupted 3 days later when Daniel Morrison failed to appear for a planned evening together, despite his habit of punctuality and his practice of sending word if he would be delayed. Clara May had initially assumed that his surveying work had taken longer than expected, but when a full day passed without any communication, she had ridden to the temporary camp where Daniel had been staying while working in the area. What she found at the campsite filled her with a dread that she could barely comprehend. Daniel's surveying equipment was scattered across the ground as if it had been thrown about in haste or anger. His personal belongings were missing, along with his horse and saddle, but there were clear signs of a struggle, including torn fabric from his shirt, caught on a nearby bush, and disturbed ground that suggested someone had been dragged away from the campsite. Clara May had immediately ridden to the sheriff's office in the nearest town, a hard day's ride from the ranch, but Sheriff William Parker had been less than helpful in investigating Daniel's disappearance. Parker was a political appointee with limited law enforcement experience, more concerned with maintaining peaceful relations with prominent local citizens than with pursuing difficult investigations that might prove controversial or dangerous. The Sheriff had made a perfunctory visit to Daniel's abandoned campsite, spent less than an hour examining the evidence, and concluded that the young surveyor had probably been the victim of a robbery by drifters or hostile Indians. When Clara May pressed him to organize a proper search or to contact the territorial authorities about a missing government employee, Parker had suggested that Daniel might have simply decided to leave the area for personal reasons, taking his belongings and abandoning his surveying equipment to make his departure appear involuntary. Clara May had known immediately that such an explanation was impossible. Daniel was not the kind of man who would disappear without explanation, particularly when he was engaged to be married and committed to completing a government contract. More importantly, he would never have abandoned his surveying equipment, which represented both his livelihood and his professional reputation. The instruments were expensive and precisely calibrated, irreplaceable tools that no surveyor would willingly leave behind under any circumstances. Frustrated by Sheriff Parker's lack of interest in pursuing a real investigation, Clara May had organized her own search efforts with the help of neighboring ranchers and their hired hands. For 2 weeks, groups of mounted men had scoured the mountains and valleys around Daniel's last known location, looking for any trace of what had happened to him or where he might have been taken. They found nothing except the disturbed campsite and a few pieces of torn clothing that confirmed a struggle had taken place. Ezekiel Henderson had participated in these search efforts, but Clara May noticed that her grandfather seemed more resigned than hopeful about finding Daniel alive. When she pressed him about his pessimistic attitude, Ezekiel had made cryptic comments about some troubles being too dangerous to pursue and some secrets being better left buried. At the time, Clara May had interpreted these remarks as the natural caution of an old man who had seen enough violence and tragedy to understand that not all stories had happy endings. The search for Daniel. Morrison had been abandoned after 3 weeks when no additional evidence could be found, and the other ranchers concluded that whoever had taken him was long gone from the area. Clara May had refused to accept this conclusion, continuing to ride out alone to search remote areas that the organized groups had not thoroughly explored. But as weeks turned into months with no sign of Daniel or any clue about what had happened to him, even Clara May had been forced to acknowledge that her fiancé was probably dead. The grief and uncertainty of Daniel's disappearance had poisoned Clara May's relationship with her grandfather and her feelings about life at Bitter Creek Ranch. She found herself unable to ride past the places where she and Daniel had spent time together without being overwhelmed by memories and unanswered questions. The future they had planned together seemed to mock her from every corner of the ranch, making it impossible for her to imagine rebuilding her life in the same location where her dreams had been destroyed. Ezekiel's refusal to discuss Daniel's disappearance or to speculate about what might have happened had created a barrier between them that had never existed before. Clara May felt that her grandfather was keeping secrets related to the tragedy, though she had no evidence to support such suspicions. The old rancher's apparent resignation to Daniel's fate and his discouragement of her efforts to continue searching suggested knowledge that he was unwilling to share. The final argument that had driven Clara May away from Montana had erupted. On a cold February evening, when she had announced her intention to hire a private detective to investigate Daniel's disappearance, Ezekiel had exploded with anger, forbidding her to waste money on what he called a hopeless cause and demanding that she accept Daniel's death and move on with her life. When Clara May had accused him of knowing more about the situation than he was willing to admit, Ezekiel had ordered her to stop asking questions that could only lead to trouble for everyone involved. Their shouting match had ended with Clara May declaring her intention to leave Bitter Creek Ranch and make a new life for herself in San Francisco, where she could escape the memories and the unanswered questions that haunted every day in Montana. Ezekiel had made no attempt to stop her, though Clara May thought she had seen tears in his eyes as she packed her belongings and prepared to catch the eastbound stage that would take her to the railroad and eventually to California. The years in San Francisco had been difficult, but had served their purpose of helping Clara May build a new identity, separate from the tragedy that had destroyed her happiness in Montana. She had found work, made friends, and even received attention from men who wanted to court her, though she had never been able to commit to a new romantic relationship. The memory of Daniel Morrison and the mystery of his disappearance had remained like a shadow over her heart, preventing her from fully embracing the possibilities of a different kind of future. Now, sitting in her grandfather's kitchen with the shocking revelation of his criminal past spread before her, Clara May began to understand the connections she had been too young and innocent to recognize 5 years earlier. Thomas McCarthy's visit to the ranch, Daniel's subsequent disappearance, and Ezekiel's strange behavior during the search efforts suddenly formed a pattern that explained the old rancher's lifetime of secrecy and guilt. The Spanish silver coins seemed to glint accusingly in the lamplight as Clara May realized that Daniel Morrison had probably died because of her grandfather's association with the James gang and the treasure hidden somewhere on the ranch property. The young surveyor's disappearance had not been a random act of violence by drifters or hostile Indians, but a deliberate elimination of someone who had somehow learned about secrets that powerful people were determined to keep buried. The months following Daniel Morrison's disappearance had marked the beginning of Clara May's gradual descent into a nightmare that would ultimately drive her away from everything she had ever known and loved. What she hadn't understood at the time, but now realized with horrifying clarity, was that her grandfather's past had finally caught up with them, bringing violence and tragedy to Bitter Creek Ranch in ways that would forever change the Henderson family legacy. The first sign that something more sinister than a random robbery had claimed Daniel's life came 2 weeks after his disappearance, when Clara May discovered that someone had been systematically searching the ranch buildings during the night. She had risen early one morning to find that the barn doors were standing open despite her certainty that she had secured them the previous evening. Inside, the hay bales had been moved and restacked as if someone had been looking for hidden compartments or buried items beneath the stored feed. Initially, Clara May had assumed that the disturbance was the work of drifters seeking shelter or supplies, a common enough occurrence on isolated ranches where travelers might take what they needed without asking permission. But when she mentioned the incident to her grandfather, Ezekiel's reaction had been far more alarmed than the situation seemed to warrant. The old rancher had immediately begun carrying a rifle whenever he left the house, and he had installed new locks on all the outbuildings, as if he expected the nighttime searches to continue. Over the following weeks, Clara May had discovered evidence of similar intrusions in the smokehouse, the root cellar, and even the main house itself. Someone was conducting a methodical search of the entire ranch, looking for something specific with a persistence that suggested they knew exactly what they hoped to find. The searcher was careful and professional, replacing items almost exactly as they had been found, but Clara May had lived on the ranch long enough to notice subtle signs that her belongings had been examined and her grandfather's possessions had been carefully inspected. Ezekiel's behavior during this period had become increasingly erratic and fearful. The man who had always projected strength and confidence now jumped at unexpected sounds and spent long hours sitting on the front porch with a shotgun across his knees, watching for riders approaching the ranch. He had begun sleeping in the main room rather than his bedroom, positioning himself where he could see all the approaches to the house and respond quickly to any threat. Most disturbing of all, Ezekiel had started talking about selling the ranch and moving to California or Oregon, abandoning the life he had spent nearly 20 years building in Montana Territory. When Clara May questioned him about this sudden change of heart, her grandfather had made vague references to old debts coming, due and past mistakes that could no longer be ignored. He spoke of men who held grudges for decades and would travel any distance to settle scores that most people would have forgotten. The night searches had continued for more than a month, each one more thorough and aggressive than the last. Clara May had taken to sleeping with a pistol under her pillow and had arranged signals with the ranch hands so that any unusual activity would bring immediate help. But the intruders seemed to know exactly when the property was most vulnerable, conducting their searches when Clara May was visiting neighbors or when the hired hands were working in distant pastures. The breakthrough in understanding what was happening had come from an unexpected source. Miguel Santos, an elderly Mexican man who had worked as a horse trainer for various ranches throughout the territory, had appeared at Bitter Creek Ranch one morning, seeking temporary employment. Santos was known throughout the region as an honest worker and an expert with difficult horses, but there was something in his manner that suggested he had come to the Henderson Ranch for reasons beyond simple employment. After working for 3 days with the Henderson horses, Santos had approached Clara May privately and asked to speak with her grandfather about a matter of mutual concern. The conversation that followed, conducted partly in Spanish and partly in English, had revealed information that explained both Daniel Morrison's disappearance and the ongoing searches of the ranch property. According to Santos, word had spread throughout the network of former outlaws, their associates and their enemies, that Ezekiel Henderson was in possession of a significant portion of the James Gang's stolen treasure. Thomas McCarthy, the supposed cattle buyer who had visited the ranch shortly before Daniel's disappearance, was actually a bounty hunter and treasure seeker who made his living tracking down former gang members and forcing them to reveal the locations of hidden loot. Santos explained that McCarthy had a reputation for using extreme methods to extract information from his targets, including kidnapping and torturing innocent people, to pressure former outlaws into cooperation. The old Mexican warned that McCarthy would not give up his search for the Henderson treasure, and that he would continue to use increasingly violent tactics until he found what he was looking for, or until someone stopped him permanently. The revelation that Daniel Morrison had been kidnapped as leverage against her grandfather had filled Clara May with a rage and grief that threatened to consume her entirely. The young surveyor had died, not because of anything he had done, but simply because he had been in the wrong place at the wrong time when McCarthy decided to pressure Ezekiel Henderson into revealing the location of stolen treasure. Daniel had become a victim of crimes committed before he was even born, sacrificed to pay for Ezekiel's youthful association with the James Gang. Ezekiel's confession to Santos, delivered in Clara May's presence with obvious reluctance and shame, had revealed the full scope of the moral compromises that had shaped his entire adult life. The old rancher admitted that he had been contacted by McCarthy several months before the man's visit to the ranch, initially through letters that demanded information about the location of silver stolen during the 1868 train robbery. When Ezekiel had ignored these demands, McCarthy had escalated his tactics, threatening to expose Ezekiel's criminal past to territorial authorities and local newspapers. The kidnapping of Daniel Morrison had been McCarthy's way of demonstrating that he was prepared to harm innocent people to achieve his objectives. According to Santos, who had connections throughout the criminal underworld of the American West, McCarthy had tortured Daniel for information about the ranch's layout and the Henderson family's routines, believing that the young surveyor might have discovered the treasure's location during his mapping work. When Daniel had been unable to provide the information McCarthy wanted, because he genuinely knew nothing about any hidden treasure, the bounty hunter had killed him and disposed of his body in a location that would never be found. McCarthy had then begun the systematic search of the ranch property, convinced that persistence and professional techniques would eventually lead him to the stolen silver that represented a fortune by the standards of 1882. The knowledge that Daniel had died for nothing, killed by a man seeking treasure that might not even exist in the locations McCarthy was searching, had driven Clara May to the edge of complete despair. She had demanded that her grandfather reveal the exact location of the hidden silver so that it could be turned over to McCarthy in exchange for an end to the violence and terror that had destroyed her happiness. But Ezekiel had refused, arguing that giving in to McCarthy's demands would only encourage other treasure hunters and bounty hunters to target the Henderson family. More importantly, Ezekiel had revealed that the stolen silver was hidden in a location that was virtually impossible to access without extensive preparation and considerable risk. The James gang had chosen their hiding place specifically because it was defensible and could only be reached by people who knew exactly how to navigate the dangerous terrain that surrounded it. Even if he wanted to retrieve the treasure and turn it over to McCarthy, Ezekiel explained, doing so would require weeks of preparation and would expose them to even greater dangers from the natural hazards that protected the hiding place. The final confrontation with McCarthy had come on a cold November night when the bounty hunter had abandoned stealth in favor of direct intimidation. Clara May had awakened to find armed men surrounding the ranch house, with McCarthy himself standing on the front porch demanding that Ezekiel Henderson come outside to discuss terms for ending their conflict. The scene had been illuminated by torches that cast dancing shadows across the yard, creating an atmosphere of menace that made Clara May's blood run cold. Ezekiel had emerged from the house carrying his rifle, but clearly understanding that he was outnumbered and outgunned by McCarthy's hired associates. The conversation that followed had been conducted in voices loud enough for Clara May to hear. From her position inside the house, where she crouched with a pistol in her hands and prepared to defend her home against whatever violence might follow. McCarthy had made his demands plain and simple. He wanted the exact location of the James gang treasure, detailed instructions for accessing the hiding place, and compensation for the time and money he had invested in tracking down the stolen silver. In exchange, he would disappear from Montana territory and never trouble the Henderson family again. If Ezekiel refused to cooperate, McCarthy promised that the violence and intimidation would escalate until the old rancher was broken or dead. Ezekiel's response had surprised both Clara May and McCarthy with its quiet dignity and firm resolve. The old rancher had acknowledged his criminal past and accepted responsibility for the consequences of his youthful choices, but he had refused to be intimidated into revealing information that would only lead to more violence and tragedy. He pointed out that the treasure McCarthy sought had been stolen from innocent people and that turning it over to another criminal would perpetuate rather than resolve the injustices of the original crime. The standoff had ended when Miguel Santos and several neighboring ranchers, alerted by the glow of torches and the sound of raised voices, had arrived at Bitter Creek Ranch with enough armed men to outnumber McCarthy's gang. Faced with overwhelming opposition and the prospect of a battle he could not win, McCarthy had withdrawn, with threats that his pursuit of the Henderson treasure would continue until he achieved his objectives or died in the attempt. The temporary victory had provided little comfort to Clara May, who understood that McCarthy would return with better planning and more men once he had regrouped from this setback. The bounty hunter's retreat had been tactical rather than permanent, and the danger to the Henderson family had actually increased because McCarthy now knew that Ezekiel was prepared to resist his demands rather than cooperate with them. In the days that followed the confrontation, Clara May had watched her grandfather age visibly under the weight of guilt and fear that had finally caught up with him. Ezekiel had begun making preparations for what he clearly believed would be his final battle with the forces he had been avoiding for nearly 15 years. He had written letters to lawyers in Helena, updating his will and making arrangements for Clara May to inherit the ranch regardless of what happened to him. Most painfully, Ezekiel had finally told Clara May the complete truth about Daniel Morrison's death, including details that Santos had not revealed during his earlier warnings. About McCarthy's methods. The young surveyor had been kept alive for several days, while McCarthy attempted to extract information from him, tortured both physically and psychologically in an effort to make him reveal knowledge he did not possess. Daniel's final hours had been spent not knowing why he was being tortured or what his captors wanted from him, dying in confusion and terror for crimes he had never committed. The revelation of Daniel's suffering had broken something fundamental in Clara May's relationship with her grandfather and her connection to Bitter Creek Ranch. She could no longer look at the familiar landscapes without thinking about the violence that had been committed there, or sit in the comfortable house without remembering that its very existence was built on stolen money and blood. The ranch that had represented security and family legacy had been transformed into a monument to the cost of moral compromise and the way past sins continued to destroy innocent lives. Clara May's decision to leave Montana had been driven not just by grief over Daniel's death, but by her inability to continue living with the knowledge of how that death had occurred and why her grandfather had allowed it to happen. She felt betrayed by Ezekiel's lifelong deception about his criminal past, but even more devastated by his failure to protect Daniel from the consequences of those long-hidden crimes. The final argument between Clara May and her grandfather had erupted when she demanded that he reveal the location of the treasure to her so that she could retrieve it and turn it over to McCarthy, ending the cycle of violence that had already claimed Daniel's life and threatened to destroy what remained of their family. Ezekiel's refusal to provide this information, based on his stated belief that the treasure should remain hidden rather than reward another criminal, had seemed to Clara May like stubborn pride that valued abstract principles more than human lives. What Clara May had not understood at the time, but now realized as she sat with her grandfather's confession letter in her hands, was that Ezekiel's refusal to reveal the treasure's location had been motivated by more than moral principles. The old rancher had been protecting Clara May from knowledge that would make her a target for every treasure hunter and bounty hunter in the American West, understanding that some secrets were too dangerous to share, even with family members who deserved to know the truth. The winter of 1887 had descended upon Bitter Creek Ranch like a shroud, bringing with it a series of catastrophes that would force Clara May Henderson to confront the most impossible decision of her life. Standing now in her grandfather's kitchen 5 years later, she could still remember the bone-deep cold of that February morning, when she had awakened to discover that everything she thought she understood about survival and sacrifice was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined possible. The crisis had begun with the arrival of Sheriff William Parker at dawn, his face grim with news that would shatter what remained of Clara May's faith in justice and the protection of law enforcement. Parker had ridden through a blizzard to reach the ranch, his horse lathered with sweat despite the freezing temperatures, carrying information that could not wait for better weather or more convenient timing. Thomas McCarthy was dead, the sheriff, announced without preamble, shot down in a saloon in Billings 3 days earlier during a confrontation with a man whose identity remained unknown. But McCarthy's death had not ended the threat to the Henderson family. Instead, It had created a new and more dangerous situation that would test every principle Ezekiel Henderson had spent his lifetime defending. According to Sheriff Parker's account, McCarthy had been drinking heavily and boasting about the fortune he intended to claim from an old rancher who had once ridden with Jesse James. The bounty hunter had been careless with details about his target, revealing enough information about Ezekiel Henderson and Bitter Creek Ranch to attract the attention of other men who made their living hunting down former outlaws and their hidden treasures. Word of the Henderson treasure had spread throughout the criminal underworld of the American West with the speed that only truly valuable information could achieve. Within days of McCarthy's death, Sheriff Parker explained, at least 3 separate groups of treasure hunters and bounty hunters had begun making inquiries about the location of Bitter Creek Ranch and the background of its owner. The Henderson family was no longer dealing with a single determined adversary, but with multiple groups of armed men who would compete with each other for the right to claim whatever fortune Ezekiel had hidden. The sheriff's warning had come with an ultimatum that revealed the extent to which corruption had penetrated territorial law enforcement. Parker explained that he could no longer guarantee the safety of the Henderson family, not because he lacked the authority to protect them, but because some of the men seeking the treasure had connections to political figures who could influence his career and his ability to continue serving as sheriff. More disturbing still, Parker revealed that he had been approached by representatives of these treasure-hunting groups, men who had offered him substantial payments in exchange for information about Ezekiel Henderson's background and cooperation in any efforts to pressure the old rancher into revealing the location of his hidden wealth. The sheriff claimed to have refused these offers, but his manner suggested that his loyalty could not be counted upon if the pressure became too intense or the bribes became too tempting. Parker's visit had concluded with advice that amounted to abandonment of any pretense of law enforcement protection. He suggested that Ezekiel consider cooperating with the treasure hunters, arguing that voluntary disclosure of the hiding place would be preferable to the violence that would inevitably result from continued resistance. The sheriff painted a grim picture of what would happen when multiple groups of armed men converged on Bitter Creek Ranch, competing with each other while using increasingly brutal tactics to extract information from the Henderson family. After Parker's departure, Clara May had found herself alone with her grandfather in a house that suddenly felt more like a fortress under siege than a family home. Ezekiel's response to the sheriff's warnings had been to begin making preparations for what he clearly believed would be a final battle, checking his weapons and reviewing defensive positions around the ranch buildings with the methodical attention of a man who had faced similar situations during his outlaw years. But the true crisis had emerged, not from the external threats that were gathering around Bitter Creek Ranch, but from revelations about the ranch's financial situation that Ezekiel had been concealing from Clara May throughout the months since Daniel Morrison's disappearance. The systematic searches of the property and the constant state of armed vigilance had made normal ranch operations impossible, resulting in neglected cattle, missed opportunities to sell livestock at favorable prices, and mounting debts that threatened the Henderson family's economic survival. Ezekiel's confession about the ranch's financial condition had been delivered with the same quiet resignation that had marked all his admissions about his criminal past. The costs of maintaining extra security, the lost income from disrupted operations, and the legal expenses associated with Daniel Morrison's disappearance had exhausted the ranch's cash reserves and forced Ezekiel to mortgage the property to cover immediate expenses. The mortgage holder was Harrison Cattle Company, a large operation based in Denver that had been acquiring smaller ranches throughout the territory as part of an expansion strategy designed to create a cattle empire spanning multiple states. Harrison's business model involved making loans to struggling ranchers at favorable initial terms, then foreclosing when the borrowers inevitably defaulted, allowing the company to acquire valuable rangeland at prices far below market value. Ezekiel explained that he had been forced to accept Harrison's terms because no other lender would provide the substantial sum needed to keep Bitter Creek Ranch operational while dealing with the security threats and disrupted income that had resulted from McCarthy's campaign of intimidation. The mortgage required quarterly payments that were manageable during good years but would become impossible to meet if the ranch continued to operate under siege conditions. The next payment was due in 6 weeks, Ezekiel revealed, and the ranch's current financial position made it impossible to meet this obligation through normal operations. The cattle that should have been sold the previous fall had been scattered by the nighttime intrusions and the constant presence of armed men, making it difficult to gather the herds for transport to market. Even if the livestock could be assembled and sold immediately, the proceeds would not be sufficient to satisfy Harrison Cattle Company's demands. Clara May had felt the walls of her world closing in as she absorbed the implications of her grandfather's financial confession. The ranch that represented her family's legacy and her own potential future was about to be lost to foreclosure, regardless of what happened with the treasure hunters who were converging on the property. Even if Ezekiel could somehow defend against the immediate threats to their physical safety, the Henderson family would still lose everything they had built over nearly 20 years. The cruel irony of the situation had not been lost on either Clara May or her grandfather. Somewhere on the ranch property, according to Ezekiel's confession letter, lay enough Spanish silver to pay off the mortgage, fund necessary improvements, and secure the ranch's financial future for generations to come. But accessing that treasure would require revealing its location to people who could not be trusted, potentially creating even greater dangers while violating every principle that had guided Ezekiel's adult life. Ezekiel's refusal to consider retrieving the hidden treasure had been absolute and final. He argued that the silver had been stolen from innocent people and that using it to solve their current financial problems would make the Henderson family complicit in the original crimes. More practically, he pointed out that any attempt to spend large amounts of Spanish silver would immediately attract attention from law enforcement officers, treasure hunters, and criminals who would correctly assume that much more wealth remained hidden. The old rancher had also expressed concerns about the physical dangers involved in accessing the treasure's hiding place. According to his confession letter, the James gang had chosen a location that was naturally defended but extremely hazardous to reach, requiring specialized knowledge and equipment that Ezekiel was no longer confident he could manage at his advanced age. Even if they decided to risk the moral and practical consequences of retrieving the stolen silver, there was no guarantee that they would survive the attempt to claim it. Clara May's frustration with her grandfather's stubborn adherence to moral principles had reached a breaking point during their discussions of potential solutions to the ranch's financial crisis. She argued that abstract ethical considerations were meaningless if they resulted in the loss of everything their family had built, pointing out that the innocent victims of the original train robbery were long dead and could not be helped by continued concealment of the stolen treasure. More importantly, Clara May had contended that they had a responsibility to the ranch employees and neighboring families who depended on Bitter Creek Ranch for their economic stability. Miguel Santos and the other hired hands had families to support, and their livelihoods would be destroyed if the ranch was foreclosed. The local community had developed economic relationships with the Henderson operation that would be severely disrupted if Harrison Cattle Company took control of the property. Ezekiel's response to these arguments had revealed the depth of his guilt and self-hatred over the choices he had made as a young man. The old rancher acknowledged that his criminal past was destroying the lives of innocent people in the present, but he maintained that using stolen money to solve their problems would only perpetuate the cycle of injustice that had begun with the original train robbery. He seemed to believe that accepting financial ruin was the only way to atone for his youthful crimes and break the pattern of violence that had already claimed Daniel Morrison's life. The final crisis had erupted when Clara May discovered that Ezekiel had been negotiating secretly with Harrison Cattle Company, exploring the possibility of selling the ranch voluntarily rather than waiting for foreclosure proceedings to begin. The old rancher had apparently decided that immediate surrender would be preferable to the prolonged struggle that would inevitably end in the same result, while potentially exposing Clara May to dangers that he was no longer capable of protecting her from. That Clara May's confrontation with her grandfather over these secret negotiations had been the most bitter argument of their entire relationship. She accused him of giving up without fighting, of allowing his guilt over past crimes to paralyze him when decisive action was needed to save their family's future. Ezekiel had responded by revealing additional details about the threats they were facing, including specific information about the men who were seeking the treasure and their reputations for extreme violence. According to intelligence that Ezekiel had gathered through his remaining connections in the criminal underworld, at least one of the treasure hunting groups was led by former Confederate soldiers who had turned to banditry after the Civil War and were known for torturing entire families to extract information about hidden wealth. Another group included Mexican bandits who had crossed the border specifically to claim the Henderson treasure, men who would have no hesitation about killing anyone who stood between them and a fortune in Spanish silver. The most dangerous group, Ezekiel explained, was organized by a man named Colonel James Bradford, a former Union Army officer who had been cashiered from military service for war crimes committed during the occupation of the South. Bradford had spent the years since the war building a network of former soldiers, displaced persons, and career criminals who specialized in tracking down and claiming treasure from the Civil War era and the outlaw period that had followed. Bradford's reputation for systematic brutality had made him legendary throughout the criminal underworld of the American West. According to the stories that Ezekiel had heard, Bradford would typically capture entire families, then torture the weakest members while forcing the others to watch, continuing until someone provided the information he sought or until everyone was dead. The former colonel treated treasure hunting as a military campaign, using tactics learned during wartime to break down resistance and achieve his objectives regardless of the human cost. Catherine's laugh was genuinely amused rather than mocking, as if she appreciated Clara May's attempt at deception while recognizing its futility. "Mrs. Henderson, I've spent the better part of 5 years researching your grandfather's background and his connection to certain events that took place in Missouri during the late 1860s. I know about the train robbery near Jefferson City, the division of the stolen silver among the gang members, and your grandfather's role in transporting his share to Montana Territory." The woman's detailed knowledge sent a wave of fear through Clara May, who realized that Catherine Moreau possessed information that went far beyond rumors and speculation. This was not a casual treasure hunter following vague leads, but someone who had conducted thorough research and probably knew more about Ezekiel Henderson's criminal past than Clara May herself had learned from his confession letter. "More importantly," Catherine continued, "I know about the young surveyor who disappeared 5 years ago and the circumstances that forced you to leave Montana Territory. Thomas McCarthy was a crude and violent man whose methods ultimately led to his death, but his activities served a useful purpose by confirming that the treasure exists and narrowing down its probable location." Clara May felt her composure beginning to crack as Catherine demonstrated knowledge of Daniel Morrison's fate and the events that had driven her away from the ranch. The woman's casual reference to McCarthy's death suggested that she might have been involved in the bounty hunter's demise, either directly or through associates who had eliminated a competitor for the Henderson treasure. "What do you want from me?" Clara May asked, abandoning any pretense that she was unaware of the treasure's existence. Catherine's smile became more genuine, as if she appreciated Clara May's decision to engage in honest conversation rather than continuing to maintain transparent deceptions. "I want to propose a partnership, Mrs. Henderson," Catherine said, moving, to sit in one of the chairs near the fireplace with the easy confidence of someone who was accustomed to being in control of negotiations. "You possess knowledge that I need, specifically the location of your grandfather's hidden cache. I possess resources that you need, including the expertise and equipment necessary to safely recover the treasure and the connections required to convert it into usable wealth without attracting unwanted attention." The proposal was tempting in its apparent simplicity, but Clara May understood that any partnership with Catherine Moreau would involve dangers and complications that she was only beginning to comprehend. The woman's sophisticated approach and obvious resources suggested that she was a far more formidable adversary than Thomas McCarthy had been, capable of using both persuasion and force to achieve her objectives. "What makes you think I have any knowledge about hidden treasure?" Clara May asked, though she knew the question was futile, given Catherine's demonstrated understanding of the situation. The woman reached into her jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio, from which she extracted several documents that she spread across the table, with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made similar presentations before. The first document was a detailed map of Montana Territory, marked with locations that corresponded to known Jesse James gang activities and the probable routes that fleeing outlaws would have taken to reach safe havens in remote areas. The second was a copy of the train robbery report from Missouri, complete with descriptions of the stolen items and estimates of their value. The third was a photograph of Ezekiel Henderson, taken sometime in the 1870s, showing him standing beside a younger man who bore a strong resemblance to Frank James. But it was the fourth document that truly shocked Clara May and demonstrated the extent of Catherine Moreau's research capabilities. It was a letter written in Ezekiel's handwriting, addressed to someone named Marcus and dated 1869, describing the successful transport of his share of the robbery proceeds to Montana Territory and his plans for establishing a legitimate business that would provide cover for his retirement from criminal activities. "Where did you get this?" Clara May demanded, recognizing her grandfather's distinctive penmanship and understanding that the letter provided confirmation of details that she had learned only from his confession. Catherine's expression became slightly smug, as if she were pleased to demonstrate the thoroughness of her preparation. "I have sources throughout the former Confederate states and the Western Territories, Mrs. Henderson, men who rode with various outlaw gangs during the post-war period are not difficult to locate if you know where to look and how to encourage their cooperation. Your grandfather was not as careful about destroying evidence as he believed, and there are people who remember details about his activities that he probably assumed had been forgotten." The implications of Catherine's resources and connections were staggering to Clara May, who began to understand that she was dealing with someone who operated at a level of sophistication far beyond anything she had previously encountered. This was not a lone treasure hunter or a small gang of opportunists, but apparently part of a larger organization with the capability to conduct extensive research and coordinate complex operations across multiple territories. "What kind of partnership are you proposing?" Clara May asked, though she dreaded hearing the answer. Catherine leaned forward slightly, her manner becoming more businesslike as she outlined terms that had clearly been prepared in advance. "I will provide all the resources necessary to locate and recover your grandfather's treasure, including specialized equipment, experienced personnel, and security arrangements to protect us from other parties who may be seeking the same goal. In exchange, you will provide the specific information needed to locate the hiding place and assist in the recovery operation. We will divide the proceeds equally, with each party receiving 50% of whatever we recover." The offer was generous by the standards of such arrangements, but Clara May understood that Catherine's willingness to share the profits equally suggested that she believed the treasure was substantial enough to make even half the total value worth the considerable investment she was proposing to make. The woman's confidence also suggested that she possessed backup plans and alternative methods for achieving her objectives if Clara May refused to cooperate voluntarily. "How do I know I can trust you?" Clara May asked, though she suspected that trust was an irrelevant consideration in dealings with someone like Catherine Moreau. The woman's smile became predatory, revealing teeth that were too perfect and eyes that were too calculating. "You don't, Mrs. Henderson, just as I don't know whether I can trust you. But we both have incentives to honor our agreement that go beyond simple goodwill. You need my resources to recover the treasure safely, and I need your knowledge to locate it efficiently. Neither of us can achieve our objectives without the other, which creates a practical foundation for cooperation that is more reliable than trust." Catherine rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out at the ranch buildings and surrounding landscape with the appraising attention of someone who was evaluating tactical considerations. When she turned back to Clara May, her expression had become more serious, as if she were about to reveal information that would change the nature of their negotiation. "There's something else you should know, Mrs. Henderson. You are not the only person who has inherited knowledge about hidden treasure from deceased relatives. Word of your grandfather's death has spread throughout certain circles, and there are at least 3 other groups preparing to converge on this area within the next few weeks. Some of these people are considerably less civilized than I am, and they will not be interested in partnerships or negotiations." The warning sent a chill through Clara May as she realized that Catherine Moreau might represent the most reasonable option among several dangerous alternatives. The woman's sophisticated approach and apparent willingness to share the profits equally could be far preferable to the violent tactics that other treasure hunters might employ. "What happens if I refuse your offer?" Clara May asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Catherine's expression became regretful, as if she were genuinely sorry about the limited options available to them both. The knowledge that such men were converging on Bitter Creek Ranch had filled Clara May with a terror that went beyond concern for her own safety. She began to understand why her grandfather was considering surrender rather than resistance, recognizing that the forces they were facing were far beyond anything that could be handled by an old rancher and his young granddaughter, even with the help of loyal ranch hands and sympathetic neighbors. But surrender meant the loss of everything the Henderson family had built, the destruction of a legacy that had taken nearly 20 years to establish, and the abandonment of employees and community members who depended on the ranch for their survival. Clara May found herself caught between the impossibility of successful resistance and the unacceptability of voluntary defeat, facing a choice that seemed to offer only different forms of destruction. The final straw had come when Clara May learned that Ezekiel had already signed preliminary agreements with Harrison Cattle Company, committing to transfer ownership of Bitter Creek Ranch within 30 days in exchange for assumption of the mortgage debt and a small cash payment that would allow the Henderson family to relocate elsewhere. The old rancher had made this decision without consulting Clara May, apparently believing that he was protecting her from having to participate in choices that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Clara May's discovery of the signed agreements had precipitated the final confrontation that would drive her away from Montana Territory and her grandfather forever. She demanded that Ezekiel reveal the location of the hidden treasure so that she could make her own decision about whether to retrieve it and use it to save the ranch. When the old rancher refused, arguing that such knowledge would only put her in greater danger, Clara May had threatened to leave immediately and never return. The argument had escalated until both Clara May and Ezekiel were shouting accusations and counter-accusations that revealed years of accumulated resentment and misunderstanding. Clara May accused her grandfather of cowardice and selfishness, arguing that his refusal to fight for their family's legacy was really an attempt to ease his own conscience at the expense of everyone who depended on him. Ezekiel had responded by accusing Clara May of naivety and recklessness, claiming that she had no understanding of the forces they were facing or the consequences of the choices she was demanding that he make. The confrontation had ended with Clara May's announcement that she was leaving for San Francisco immediately, before the treasure hunters arrived and before Harrison Cattle Company took possession of the ranch. She declared that she could not bear to watch her grandfather surrender everything their family had built without making any effort to fight for their legacy and their future. Ezekiel's final words to Clara May had been a warning that she would someday understand the wisdom of his choices, but by then it might be too late to avoid the consequences of seeking easy solutions to problems that had no good answers. The old rancher had made no attempt to stop her from leaving, though Clara May had seen tears in his eyes as she packed her belongings and prepared to catch the stage that would take her away from Montana Territory forever. Now, 5 years later, Clara May finally understood the impossible position her grandfather had been in during those final weeks at Bitter Creek Ranch. Reading his confession letter and examining the evidence of the hidden treasure, she realized that Ezekiel had been trying to protect her from knowledge that would make her a target, while also preventing her from making choices that would compromise her moral integrity and endanger her physical safety. The Spanish silver coins seemed to mock her from their position on the kitchen table, representing both the solution to problems she had not even known existed and the source of dangers that had destroyed her previous happiness and threatened to destroy her future. Clara May began to understand that inheriting Bitter Creek Ranch meant inheriting not just property and livestock, but also the moral dilemmas and physical threats that came with possessing knowledge about one of the most famous treasure hoards in American outlaw history. The morning sun was just beginning to cast long shadows across the ranch yard when Clara May heard the sound of approaching horses, their hoofbeats creating a rhythm that seemed to match the pounding of her heart as she realized her grandfather's past had finally caught up with her. Through the kitchen window, she watched as 3 riders emerged from the morning mist, their silhouettes dark against the golden landscape that had once represented nothing more complicated than home and security. The lead rider was a woman, which surprised Clara May enough that she moved closer to the window for a better view. The figure sat her horse with the confidence of someone who had spent years in the saddle, and as the group drew closer, Clara May could see that she was perhaps 40 years old, with steel-grey hair pulled back severely, and clothing that was practical rather than fashionable. There was something about the woman's bearing that suggested both authority and danger, as if she were accustomed to command and unafraid of whatever resistance she might encounter. The 2 men who flanked her were clearly subordinates, though their own appearances suggested that they were not ordinary ranch hands or drifters seeking work. Both carried themselves with the alert posture of professional gunmen, their eyes constantly scanning the ranch buildings and surrounding terrain for potential threats or opportunities. Their weapons were visible but not ostentatiously displayed, worn with the casual familiarity of men who had used them frequently and expected to do so again. Clara May's first instinct was to retreat to the house and prepare to defend herself. But something about the woman's approach suggested that this was not an attack, but rather a negotiation. The riders had made no attempt at stealth or surprise, arriving in broad daylight and allowing themselves to be clearly observed as they approached the main house. Their manner suggested confidence rather than aggression, as if they expected to be received as visitors rather than repelled as invaders. The woman dismounted with fluid grace and approached the front porch, leaving her companions to hold the horses and maintain watch over the surrounding area. When she knocked on the door, it was with the firm authority of someone who expected to be admitted, rather than the tentative inquiry of a stranger seeking hospitality. Clara May hesitated for a moment before opening the door, her hand resting on the pistol she had taken to carrying since discovering her grandfather's confession. "Mrs. Henderson," the woman said, her voice carrying a slight accent that Clara May could not immediately identify. "My name is Catherine Moreau, and I believe we have matters of mutual interest to discuss. I've come a long way to speak with you, and I hope you'll give me the opportunity to explain why your grandfather's death has created possibilities that could benefit us both." Clara May felt a chill run down her spine at the woman's words, which confirmed that news of Ezekiel Henderson's death had already spread beyond the immediate area and attracted attention from people who understood the significance of his passing. The polite phrasing could not disguise the fact that Catherine Moreau was here because of the treasure, though her approach suggested sophistication and planning rather than the crude intimidation tactics that Thomas McCarthy had employed. "I'm not sure what you think we might have to discuss," Clara May replied carefully, though she stepped aside to allow the woman to enter the house. Catherine Moreau moved into the main room with the assessing gaze of someone who was cataloguing details and evaluating potential advantages, her attention lingering on the rifle that Clara May had left leaning against the fireplace and the maps that were spread across the dining table. "Mrs. Henderson," Catherine said with a slight smile that did not reach her eyes, "we both know that your grandfather was more than just a successful rancher. Ezekiel Henderson was a man with a remarkable past, and shall we say, certain assets that he chose never to claim during his lifetime. His death has created an opportunity for someone with the right knowledge and resources to recover items that have been lost for nearly 20 years. Clara May's mind raced as she tried to evaluate the woman's words and determine how much Catherine Moreau actually knew about the hidden treasure. The visitor's confident manner suggested that she possessed substantial information about Ezekiel's criminal past and the James Gang's activities in Montana Territory, but it was unclear whether she knew the specific location of the hiding place or was fishing for information that would complete her knowledge. "I'm afraid I don't know what you're talking about," Clara May said, though she knew her denial lacked conviction. "My grandfather was a rancher who built this operation through hard work and careful management. I'm not aware of any other assets or any reason why his death would create opportunities for anyone outside our family." "Then you will have to deal with my competitors on your own, Mrs. Henderson. I can tell you from experience that Colonel Bradford's methods are considerably more direct than mine, and the Mexican bandits who crossed the border last week are not. Known for their patience with uncooperative witnesses, my offer represents the safest and most profitable solution to a situation that will resolve itself one way or another, with or without your voluntary participation." Clara May felt the walls of her world closing in as she realized that Catherine Moreau was probably right about the limited nature of her options. The woman's arrival had confirmed that multiple groups of treasure hunters were converging on Bitter Creek Ranch, and that her grandfather's death had triggered a race to claim the hidden silver that would inevitably result in violence and destruction. But there was something about Catherine's manner that suggested she was withholding important information, details about the treasure's location or the dangers involved in recovering it that would affect Clara May's decision about whether to accept the proposed partnership. The woman's confidence seemed too complete, her preparation too thorough for someone who was entirely dependent on Clara May's cooperation. "How do I know you actually need my help?" Clara May asked, voicing the suspicion that had been growing. Throughout their conversation, "If you've researched my grandfather's background so thoroughly, you might already know enough to find the treasure without my assistance." Catherine's pause before answering was brief but significant, suggesting that Clara May had identified a crucial weakness in the woman's position. When Catherine finally spoke, her tone was more respectful, as if she recognized that Clara May was more perceptive than she had initially assumed. "You're quite right to question my motives, Mrs. Henderson. I do possess considerable information about your grandfather's activities and the probable location of his treasure. But the James gang chose their hiding places very carefully, and accessing them requires specific knowledge that was never written down or shared with outsiders. Your grandfather left certain clues that only someone who knew him intimately would be able to interpret correctly. The admission revealed that Catherine Moreau's seemingly complete knowledge had important gaps, and that Clara May's cooperation was genuinely necessary for the success of any treasure hunting expedition. This realization gave Clara May a degree of leverage in their negotiations, though she understood that it also made her more valuable and therefore more dangerous to cross. "I need time to consider your offer," Clara May said, though she knew that such time might not be available given the other threats that were apparently approaching. Catherine nodded with apparent understanding, though her expression suggested that she had expected this response and was prepared for it. "Of course, Mrs. Henderson, this is not a decision to be made lightly, but I should mention that time is not entirely on our side. My sources indicate that Colonel Bradford's group will reach this area within 10 days, and the Mexican bandits are probably already closer than that. If we're going to act, we need to begin preparations immediately." The pressure was subtle but unmistakable, designed to force Clara May into a quick decision while she was still overwhelmed by the complexity of her situation. But Catherine's willingness to allow her time to consider the offer suggested that the woman was confident about Clara May's eventual decision, as if she understood that the alternatives were too dangerous to contemplate seriously. As Catherine prepared to leave, she handed Clara May a small leather pouch containing what appeared to be several Spanish silver coins, identical to those that Clara May had found in her grandfather's hidden box. The gesture was clearly intended to demonstrate Catherine's serious intentions and her genuine knowledge of the treasure's nature, but it also served as a reminder of the wealth that could be claimed if Clara May chose to cooperate. "Think carefully about your options, Mrs. Henderson," Catherine said as she mounted her horse. "I'll return tomorrow evening for your answer. In the meantime, I suggest you avoid traveling far from the ranch house and keep your weapons close at hand. The mountains can be dangerous for a woman alone, particularly one who possesses information that certain people would kill to obtain." Hours following Catherine Moreau's departure passed with agonizing slowness, as Clara May found herself trapped between equally dangerous alternatives, each path forward seeming to lead toward destruction of a different kind. She spent the afternoon pacing through the ranch house that had once represented security, but now felt like a prison. Every creak of the wooden floors and every whisper of wind through the eaves, serving as a reminder that she was alone and vulnerable to forces she barely understood. The Spanish silver coins that Catherine had left behind lay scattered across the kitchen table like accusations, their tarnished surfaces reflecting the lamplight in ways that seemed to mock Clara May's attempts to find a moral solution to an inherently corrupt situation. She had counted them repeatedly, 23 coins in total, each one representing a fragment of the larger treasure that had shaped her family's destiny and destroyed her grandfather's peace of mind for nearly 2 decades. But it was the arrival of an unexpected visitor just before sunset that truly revealed the impossible nature of Clara May's situation and forced her to confront the reality that her grandfather's carefully guarded secrets had already become common knowledge among the most dangerous men in the American West. She first became aware of the approaching rider when her horse began showing signs of nervousness, pawing the ground and nickering softly in the way that indicated the presence of strangers in the area. The man who emerged from the gathering dusk was unlike anyone Clara May had ever encountered, his appearance so striking and intimidating that she instinctively stepped back from the window where she had been watching for signs of Catherine Moreau's return. He was tall and lean, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors under harsh conditions. But there was something about his eyes that suggested intelligence and calculation, rather than the simple brutality of a common outlaw. Most disturbing of all was the man's bearing, which combined military precision with the predatory awareness of someone who had killed frequently and expected to do so again. His clothing was well maintained but practical, designed for hard travel and quick movement rather than appearance, and his weapons were worn with the casual familiarity of tools that were used regularly and maintained meticulously. When he dismounted and approached the front porch, Clara May noticed that he moved with the controlled grace of a professional soldier, his attention constantly scanning the ranch buildings and surroundings for potential threats or tactical advantages. This was clearly not another treasure hunter seeking quick wealth, but someone who approached such endeavors with the systematic planning and ruthless efficiency of a military campaign. "Miss Henderson," the man called out, his voice carrying the educated accent of someone who had received formal schooling despite his current circumstances. "I am Colonel James Bradford, and I believe we have urgent business to discuss. I've come a considerable distance to speak with you about your grandfather's legacy and the choices you'll need to make in the very near future." Clara May felt her blood turn to ice as she recognized the name that her grandfather had mentioned with such obvious fear during his final months at Bitter Creek Ranch. This was the man whose reputation for systematic brutality had become legendary throughout the criminal underworld. The former Union Army officer whose methods had made even hardened outlaws reluctant to cross his path. Bradford's approach to the front door was unhurried but purposeful, as if he were confident that Clara May would admit him rather than force a confrontation that could only end badly for her. When she opened the door, his smile was polite but predatory, revealing teeth that were too perfect and eyes that assessed her with the clinical detachment of someone evaluating a potential source of information. "Miss Henderson," Bradford said, as he stepped into the main room without waiting for an invitation, "I trust you'll forgive the informal nature of my visit. Time constraints make it necessary to dispense with certain social niceties that would normally govern such conversations. I'm sure you understand that your grandfather's recent death has created a situation that requires immediate attention from all interested parties." Clara May's hand moved instinctively toward the pistol she had taken to carrying, but Bradford's slight shake of his head suggested that such resistance would be both futile and unnecessarily provocative. The colonel's manner was courteous but utterly confident, as if he were accustomed to being obeyed without question and expected no serious challenge to his authority. "I'm not sure what brings you to my ranch, Colonel Bradford," Clara May said, though her voice lacked conviction, and they both knew that pretense was pointless. The Colonel's laugh was genuinely amused, as if he appreciated her attempt at deception. While recognizing its transparent nature, "Miss Henderson," Bradford replied, moving to examine the maps and documents that were still spread across the dining table, "we both know that your grandfather was considerably more than a simple rancher. Ezekiel Henderson was a man with a remarkable past and certain assets that he chose never to claim during his lifetime. His death has created opportunities that I intend to pursue with or without your cooperation." The Colonel's confident examination of Clara May's grandfather's papers revealed knowledge that went far beyond anything that Catherine Moreau had demonstrated, suggesting that Bradford possessed information sources and research capabilities that exceeded even those of his sophisticated rival. When he looked up from the documents, his expression was satisfied, as if he had found confirmation of details that he had already suspected. "I've spent considerable time and resources investigating your family's history, Miss Henderson," Bradford continued, his tone becoming more businesslike as he outlined his objectives. "Your grandfather's association with the James Gang is well documented, as is his role in transporting stolen silver to Montana Territory. What interests me most, however, is the specific location of his cache and the methods he used to secure it against discovery by casual treasure hunters." Clara May realized that Bradford's knowledge was even more comprehensive than Catherine Moreau's had been, extending to details about the treasure's security arrangements that suggested he had access to information that other treasure hunters lacked. The Colonel's confidence was based not on speculation or rumor, but on solid intelligence that had been gathered through methods she could only imagine. "What do you want from me?" Clara May asked, though she dreaded hearing Bradford's answer. The Colonel's smile became more predatory, as if he were pleased that she had decided to engage in direct conversation rather than continuing to maintain pointless pretenses. "I want you to guide me to your grandfather's hiding place and assist in the recovery of the stolen silver," Bradford said with the matter-of-fact tone of someone stating obvious requirements. "In exchange, I will allow you to retain a small percentage of the recovered treasure, enough to provide for your future needs, while ensuring that you have sufficient incentive to cooperate fully with my operation." The terms were far less generous than Catherine Moreau's offer, but Clara May understood that Bradford was not negotiating so much as informing her of decisions that had already been made. The Colonel's manner suggested that he possessed alternative methods for achieving his objectives if she proved uncooperative, methods that would not require her voluntary participation or concern for her welfare. "What makes you think I have any information about hidden treasure?" Clara May asked, though she knew the question was futile given Bradford's demonstrated knowledge of her family's situation. The Colonel reached into his jacket and withdrew a leather portfolio similar to the one Catherine had used, but containing documents that immediately revealed the superior quality of his intelligence gathering. The first item was a detailed survey map of Bitter Creek Ranch and the surrounding mountain terrain, marked with locations that corresponded to probable hiding places based on topographical analysis and historical research. The second was a copy of a letter written by Frank James to an unknown recipient, describing the security arrangements that had been made for various treasure caches established by gang members throughout the Western Territories. But it was the third document that truly demonstrated the extent of Bradford's resources and the danger that Clara May was facing. It was a recent photograph of her grandfather's grave in the ranch cemetery, taken from an angle that showed not only the headstone, but also the oak tree, where Ezekiel had hidden his confession and the initial clues about the treasure's location. "You've been watching me," Clara May said, the statement carrying more fear than accusation. Bradford's nod was matter-of-fact, as if surveillance of potential sources was simply a routine aspect of professional treasure hunting operations. Of course, Miss Henderson. Your grandfather's death was not unexpected given his advanced age, and the stress of maintaining secrets that had haunted him for decades. I've had men in position to observe developments at this ranch for several months, waiting for the right moment to initiate recovery operations. The revelation that she had been under surveillance for months without knowing it filled Clara May with a sense of violation that went beyond simple fear. Bradford's organization was clearly more sophisticated and better funded than she had imagined, capable of maintaining long-term operations and gathering intelligence through methods that other treasure hunters could not match. My sources also informed me that you received a visit earlier today from Catherine Moreau, Bradford continued, his tone suggesting that he knew details about her conversation with the other treasure hunter. Miss Moreau is a capable operator, but she lacks the resources and connections necessary to handle a recovery operation of this magnitude. Her offer of partnership is essentially meaningless because she cannot deliver on the promises she has made. The casual dismissal of Catherine Moreau's capabilities was delivered with such confidence that Clara May began to wonder whether Bradford possessed information about his rival's limitations that would make cooperation with her impossible, regardless of the apparent attractiveness of her terms. The Colonel's manner suggested that he viewed other treasure hunters as minor inconveniences rather than serious competitors. "What happens if I refuse to cooperate with you?" Clara May asked, though she suspected that Bradford's answer would be far more direct than Catherine's veiled threats had been. The Colonel's expression became regretful, as if he were genuinely sorry about the limited options available to them both. "Then I will be forced to use methods that are less pleasant for everyone involved, Miss Henderson. I have considerable experience in extracting information from reluctant sources, and I can assure you that cooperation obtained through persuasion is always preferable to cooperation obtained through more direct means." The threat was delivered with such matter-of-fact calm that it was more terrifying than shouted intimidation would have been. Bradford clearly viewed torture and violence as professional tools to be used when necessary, rather than as expressions of anger or frustration that might be avoided through negotiation. Clara May felt her world narrowing to a single point of impossible choice as she realized that both Catherine Moreau and Colonel Bradford were offering her versions of the same fundamental bargain: cooperation in exchange for a share of the treasure and survival in exchange for betrayal of her grandfather's final wishes. Neither option offered genuine freedom or moral satisfaction, only different forms of compromise with forces that were beyond her ability to resist. But it was Bradford's next revelation that truly demonstrated the hopelessness of her situation, and the extent to which her grandfather's secrets had become public knowledge among the most dangerous criminals in the American West. The Colonel reached into his portfolio once more and withdrew a document that made Clara May's heart stop with recognition and horror. "This is a copy of your grandfather's confession letter, Miss Henderson," Bradford said, watching her face carefully for reactions that would confirm his assumptions. "The original was discovered among his papers by one of my associates who conducted a thorough search of this house while you were in town last week arranging funeral services." Clara May stared at the familiar handwriting that contained her grandfather's admissions about his criminal past and his instructions for finding the hidden treasure, realizing that her most crucial advantage in dealing with treasure hunters had been eliminated before she even knew it existed. Bradford possessed not only general knowledge about the treasure's existence, but specific details about its location and the methods needed to access it safely. "As you can see," Bradford continued, "your cooperation, while still valuable, is not absolutely essential for the success of my operation. I have sufficient information to locate and recover your grandfather's cash without your assistance, though your participation would make the process more efficient and reduce the risks involved for all parties. The revelation that Bradford could proceed without her cooperation removed Clara May's primary source of leverage in their negotiations, but it also raised questions about why the Colonel was bothering to seek her voluntary participation if he could achieve his objectives through independent action. There had to be additional complications or dangers that made her knowledge and assistance more valuable than he was willing to admit. "If you can find the treasure without my help," Clara May said, "why are you here at all?" Bradford's smile became genuinely appreciative, as if he were pleased that she had identified the crucial question that would determine the true nature of their relationship. "Because recovering the treasure is only half of the challenge, Miss Henderson. Converting stolen Spanish silver into usable currency without attracting attention from law enforcement requires connections and expertise that extend far beyond simple treasure hunting. Your grandfather's legitimate business operations provide perfect cover for explaining the sudden appearance of substantial wealth, but only if those operations continue under family management." Clara May began to understand that Bradford's interest in her cooperation went beyond the practical advantages of having a knowledgeable guide to the treasure's hiding place. The Colonel needed her to maintain the ranch as a functioning business that could serve as a front for laundering stolen silver into legitimate currency, a process that would require months or years of careful planning and execution. More importantly, Bradford explained, "Your continued presence at the ranch eliminates questions that would inevitably arise if you disappeared or died under mysterious circumstances immediately after your grandfather's death. Territorial authorities are not particularly sophisticated, but even they would investigate if the Henderson family line ended suspiciously, just as rumors about hidden treasure began circulating in the area." The Colonel's planning was comprehensive and coldly logical, taking into account not only the immediate challenges of recovering the treasure, but also the long-term problems of converting it into wealth that could be used without arousing suspicion. Clara May realized that she was being offered not partnership, but indentured servitude, required to maintain her ranch operations as cover for Bradford's criminal activities while receiving minimal compensation for her involuntary participation. "Need time to consider your proposal," Clara May said, though she understood that time was a luxury that Bradford was unlikely to grant, given the competitive pressure from other treasure hunters and the tactical advantages of moving quickly. The Colonel's expression became less patient, as if he had expected immediate acceptance of terms that he considered generous under the circumstances. "Time is unfortunately something we cannot afford, Miss Henderson. My intelligence indicates that Catherine Moreau plans to begin her recovery operation within days, and there are at least 2 other groups approaching this area with similar objectives. If we delay much longer, we risk finding ourselves in competition with multiple armed groups, a situation that would be dangerous for everyone involved." Bradford rose from his chair and moved toward the door, but his departure was clearly temporary rather than final. When he turned back to Clara May, his expression was polite but implacable, conveying the message that her decision was expected immediately regardless of her personal preferences or moral reservations. "I will return tomorrow." "Morning for your answer, Miss Henderson. I strongly advise you to use the intervening hours to consider your situation realistically, rather than indulging in romantic notions about resistance or escape. The forces that are converging on this ranch will resolve the treasure question, with or without your cooperation, and your survival depends on choosing the winning side before the conflict begins." The Colonel's departure left Clara May alone with the knowledge that her grandfather's death had triggered a chain of events that would inevitably destroy everything she had inherited from him, regardless of the choices she made in response to the impossible demands being placed upon her. The treasure that Ezekiel Henderson had refused to claim during his lifetime would be recovered and converted into currency that would enrich his enemies while destroying his family's legacy and the principles he had died defending. Clara May understood that she was facing the same moral test that had paralyzed her grandfather during his final years, forced to choose between abstract principles and practical survival in a situation where compromise seemed inevitable and resistance appeared suicidal. The Spanish silver coins on her kitchen table represented not just wealth, but the accumulated consequences of choices that had been made decades earlier by people who could never have imagined the suffering their decisions would cause. The dawn brought with it a clarity that Clara May had not expected, born not from any sudden revelation about the right course of action, but from the simple recognition that she could no longer allow fear and uncertainty to paralyze her as they had paralyzed her grandfather for so many years. Standing in the kitchen where she had discovered Ezekiel's confession, surrounded by the evidence of his lifelong guilt and the instruments of her own potential destruction, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. She would not surrender to Catherine Moreau's sophisticated manipulation or Colonel Bradford's calculated intimidation. Neither would she attempt to flee from responsibilities that had been thrust upon her through no fault of her own. Instead, Clara May Henderson would do something that none of the treasure hunters converging on Bitter Creek Ranch would expect. She would take control of the situation by exposing the truth and forcing a resolution that served justice rather than greed. The decision had crystallized during the long hours of the previous night, as Clara May had sat beside her grandfather's papers and truly absorbed the implications of his confession for the first time. Ezekiel Henderson had spent 20 years tormented by guilt over crimes he had committed as a young man, allowing that guilt to prevent him from taking actions that might have served the cause of justice while protecting his family from the consequences of his past. But Clara May was not her grandfather, and she was not bound by the moral paralysis that had defined his final years. She possessed advantages that Ezekiel had never enjoyed, including knowledge of her enemy's capabilities and intentions, understanding of the treasure's location and value, and most importantly, the freedom that came from having nothing left to lose except her life and her principles. The first element of her plan required her to contact the territorial authorities in Helena, providing them with evidence of the criminal conspiracy that was developing around Bitter Creek Ranch while simultaneously offering to cooperate in a legitimate recovery of the stolen treasure. Clara May understood that such cooperation would likely result in legal proceedings that could expose her family's criminal past. But she had concluded that public shame was preferable to private complicity in ongoing criminal activities. More importantly, involving territorial law enforcement would eliminate the advantage that professional treasure hunters enjoyed through operating in secrecy and isolation. Colonel Bradford and Catherine Moreau were accustomed to dealing with isolated victims who had no recourse to legal protection, but they would be far less comfortable conducting their operations under the scrutiny of federal marshals and territorial investigators. Clara May spent the early morning hours composing a detailed letter to Marshal William Thompson in Helena, outlining everything she knew about her grandfather's criminal past, the location of the hidden treasure, and the various groups that were attempting to claim it through violence and intimidation. She included copies of Ezekiel's confession letter and maps showing the probable location of the James gang's cache, ensuring that the authorities would possess sufficient information to conduct their own recovery operation if necessary. The letter was carefully crafted to present Clara May as a victim of circumstances beyond her control, rather than as a willing participant in criminal activities, emphasizing her desire to cooperate with law enforcement and her willingness to accept whatever legal consequences might result from her family's criminal past. She stressed that her primary concern was preventing the treasure from falling into the hands of criminals who would use it to fund additional illegal activities. But Clara May understood that involving the territorial authorities was only the first step in a plan that would require her to outmaneuver some of the most dangerous criminals in the American West, while protecting herself from retaliation that could prove fatal. She would need allies who possessed both the capability and the motivation to stand with her against forces that would stop at nothing to claim the Henderson treasure. The solution came from an unexpected source. Miguel Santos, the elderly Mexican horse trainer who had warned her grandfather about Thomas McCarthy's activities 5 years earlier. Santos had maintained contact with various members of the ranch community during Clara May's absence, and his arrival at Bitter Creek Ranch on the morning of her planned confrontation with the treasure hunters seemed like divine intervention. Santos brought with him news that would change the entire dynamic of the situation developing around the hidden silver. According to his sources in the criminal underworld, the Mexican bandits who had crossed the border to claim the Henderson treasure were not acting independently, but were actually working as advanced scouts for a much larger organization that included former Confederate soldiers, displaced persons from the Civil War, and career criminals from throughout the Southwestern Territories. More importantly, Santos revealed that this organization was led by a man named General Marcus Valdez, a former officer in the Mexican army who had built a network of criminal enterprises spanning both sides of the border. Valdez had been tracking down and claiming Civil War-era treasure hoards for more than a decade, using the profits to fund revolutionary activities aimed at destabilizing the governments of both Mexico and the United States. The revelation that the Henderson treasure had attracted the attention of international criminals and political revolutionaries elevated the stakes far beyond anything that Clara May had previously imagined. This was no longer simply a matter of competing treasure hunters seeking individual enrichment, but a situation that could affect the security of the entire territorial region if revolutionary organizations gained access to the substantial funding that the stolen silver represented. Santos's intelligence also revealed crucial weaknesses in the positions of both Catherine Moreau and Colonel Bradford, information that Clara May could use to her advantage in the confrontations that lay ahead. Catherine's sophisticated operation was actually funded by Eastern investors who had no knowledge of her criminal activities, and exposure of her true methods would result in the immediate withdrawal of financial support that made her operations possible. Colonel Bradford's situation was even more precarious, according to Santos's sources. The former Union officer was wanted by federal authorities for war crimes committed during his military service, and his current treasure hunting activities were being conducted in violation of specific terms of his conditional release from military prison. Any contact with territorial law enforcement would result in his immediate arrest and return to federal custody. Armed with this intelligence, Clara May prepared for the confrontations that would determine not only her own fate, but the resolution of a criminal conspiracy that had been developing for months around her family's tragic legacy. She positioned Miguel Santos and 2 of his most trusted associates in concealed locations around the ranch buildings, ensuring that any violence would be witnessed and that help would be available if negotiations deteriorated into physical confrontations. Catherine Moreau arrived first, precisely at the time she had promised, approaching the ranch house with the same confident bearing that had marked her previous visit. But Clara May noticed that the sophisticated treasure hunter's composure seemed less complete than before, as if recent developments had introduced complications that were affecting her usually perfect self-control. "Mrs. Henderson," Catherine said, as she entered the main room, "I trust you've had sufficient time to consider my proposal and reach a decision that serves both our interests. I'm prepared to begin recovery operations immediately, assuming that we can finalize the terms of our partnership without further delay." Clara May allowed Catherine to settle into her chair before delivering the response that would shatter the woman's carefully constructed plans and expose the fundamental weakness in her position. "I've given your offer considerable thought, Miss Moreau, and I've decided to decline your partnership in favor of a different approach to resolving this situation." Catherine's expression shifted from confidence to wariness as she sensed that the negotiation was not proceeding as she had anticipated. "What alternative approach do you have in mind, Mrs. Henderson?" she asked, her tone becoming more cautious as she began to evaluate potential threats to her objectives. "I've contacted the territorial authorities in Helena and provided them with complete information about my grandfather's criminal past and the location of the stolen treasure," Clara May replied, watching carefully for Catherine's reaction to this unexpected development. "Marshal Thompson will be arriving here within days to conduct an official recovery operation and investigate the various criminal conspiracies that have developed around the Henderson treasure." The announcement had exactly the effect that Clara May had hoped for, causing Catherine's carefully maintained composure to crack as the implications of law enforcement involvement became clear. The sophisticated treasure hunter's confidence had been based on operating in secrecy and isolation, using her superior resources and connections to overwhelm isolated victims who had no recourse to legal protection. But official involvement of territorial authorities would eliminate every advantage that Catherine possessed while exposing her to criminal prosecution for activities that she had been conducting throughout the Western Territories for years. Her investors would withdraw their support immediately upon learning that their money was funding illegal operations, and her network of contacts and resources would disappear as former associates sought to distance themselves from criminal activities that were under official investigation. "You don't understand what you've done," Catherine said, her voice carrying a note of panic that revealed how completely Clara May's decision had disrupted her carefully laid plans. "The authorities cannot provide the protection you think they can, and there are forces involved in this situation that will not be deterred by the presence of federal marshals." Clara May smiled with satisfaction as she realized that her strategy was achieving its intended effect of forcing Catherine to reveal information about the broader criminal conspiracy that surrounded the Henderson treasure. "I understand more than you think, Miss Moreau. I know about General Valdez and his revolutionary organization. I know about your financial backers and their lack of knowledge about your criminal activities. Most importantly, I know that you cannot afford to have this situation investigated by competent law enforcement officers." Catherine's face went pale as she realized that Clara May possessed intelligence about aspects of the treasure hunting operation that were supposed to be closely guarded secrets. The sophisticated criminal had built her entire career on information superiority and careful planning. But she was now facing an opponent who understood her weaknesses and was prepared to exploit them ruthlessly. "What do you want from me?" Catherine asked, her tone shifting from negotiation to something approaching desperation, as she began to understand that her position had become untenable. Clara May leaned forward slightly, pressing her advantage as she outlined terms that would serve justice rather than criminal enrichment. "I want you to leave Montana Territory immediately and never return. I want you to contact your associates and inform them that the Henderson treasure is now under federal protection and that any attempts to claim it will result in prosecution for theft of government evidence. Most importantly, I want you to provide me with information about the other groups that are seeking this treasure, including their capabilities and current locations." The demands were comprehensive and non-negotiable, designed to eliminate Catherine as a threat while gaining intelligence that would help Clara May deal with the remaining dangers she was facing. Catherine's hesitation before responding revealed that she was calculating the costs and benefits of cooperation versus continued resistance, trying to determine whether compliance offered better prospects than defiance. Before Catherine could formulate her response, the sound of approaching horses announced the arrival of Colonel Bradford, whose timing could not have been more perfect for Clara May's purposes. The former Union officer's appearance would provide her with the opportunity to play her enemies against each other, while demonstrating to both of them that their assumed advantages had been eliminated by her decision to involve legitimate authorities. Bradford entered the house with his usual confidence, but Clara May noticed that his bearing was more tense than during his previous visit, as if he had received intelligence about developments that were complicating his plans. The Colonel's attention immediately focused on Catherine Moreau, whose presence clearly represented an unwelcome complication in his carefully structured timeline. "Miss Henderson," Bradford said, nodding curtly to Catherine while keeping his primary attention focused on Clara May. "I trust you're prepared to provide the answer we discussed yesterday. Time constraints make it necessary to begin operations immediately before other interested parties can complicate the situation further." Clara May allowed herself a moment to savor the irony of having both of her primary tormentors present while she delivered news that would destroy both their carefully laid plans simultaneously. "Colonel Bradford, Miss Moreau, I have indeed reached a decision about how to handle my grandfather's legacy and the treasure that has attracted so much unwanted attention to my family." Both treasure hunters leaned forward slightly, their expressions revealing the tension and anticipation that came from months of planning and preparation reaching their crucial moment. Clara May understood that the next few minutes would determine whether her strategy succeeded in eliminating the threats she faced, or whether her defiance would trigger the violence that both criminals had threatened. "I have contacted Marshal William Thompson in Helena and provided him with complete information about the stolen treasure, its location, and the various criminal organizations that are attempting to claim it," Clara May announced, watching with satisfaction as both her visitors realized that their assumed advantages had been eliminated by her decision to seek legitimate protection. The responses were immediate and revealing. Catherine Moreau closed her eyes briefly as if acknowledging that her sophisticated operation had been checkmated by an opponent she had underestimated. Colonel Bradford's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon before he controlled the impulse, recognizing that violence would only confirm Clara May's allegations about his criminal intentions. "You have made a grave mistake, Mrs. Henderson," Bradford said, his voice carrying the controlled fury of a man whose carefully constructed plans had been destroyed by an unexpected act of defiance. "The authorities cannot protect you from all the forces that are converging on this location, and your cooperation with law enforcement will not prevent the recovery of treasure that rightfully belongs to those who have invested years in tracking it down." But Clara May had prepared for exactly this response, and her answer revealed the extent to which she had thought through the implications of her decision to confront the criminal conspiracy that surrounded her family's legacy. "The treasure doesn't belong to any of you, Colonel Bradford. It was stolen from innocent people 20 years ago, and it will be returned to its rightful owners or their descendants through proper legal channels rather than enriching criminals who have contributed nothing except violence and intimidation." The moral authority in Clara May's voice seemed to deflate some of Bradford's aggressive confidence, as if he were being reminded of principles that he had abandoned so completely that he had forgotten they still influenced some people's decisions. But the colonel's pause was brief, and when he spoke again, his tone carried the menace of someone who viewed moral considerations as weaknesses to be exploited. Principles are luxuries that people in your situation cannot afford, Miss Henderson. You have chosen to make enemies of forces that will not be deterred by federal marshals or territorial law enforcement. Your decision to involve the authorities has guaranteed that this situation will be resolved through violence rather than negotiation. Clara May met Bradford's threatening gaze with steady resolve, drawing strength from the knowledge that she had finally chosen to stand for something greater than her own immediate safety or convenience. Then so be it, Colonel. I would rather face whatever consequences come from doing the right thing than live with the knowledge that I enriched criminals by betraying my grandfather's final wish that this treasure be handled with honor rather than greed. The silence that followed Clara May's declaration was broken by the distant sound of gunshots echoing across the valley. Sharp reports that seemed to come from the direction of the main road leading to Bitter Creek Ranch. All three occupants of the house moved instinctively toward the windows, their personal conflicts momentarily forgotten in the face of a new and immediate threat that none of them had anticipated. Through the morning haze, Clara May could see riders approaching at full gallop, their horses lathered with foam and their postures suggesting desperate flight rather than organized attack. Behind them, barely visible through the dust and distance, came a larger group of mounted men whose pursuit was relentless and professional, closing the gap with each passing moment, despite the head start their quarry had achieved. General Valdez has arrived ahead of schedule. Miguel Santos called out from his concealed position behind the barn, his voice carrying clearly across the yard despite the distance. The Mexican scouts are being pursued by the main force, and they're leading the Revolutionary Army directly to the ranch. The news transformed the situation in the ranch house from a three-way standoff into a desperate alliance born of mutual survival needs. Colonel Bradford and Catherine Moreau exchanged glances that revealed their immediate recognition that the approaching Revolutionary Army represented a threat far greater than their competition with each other for the Henderson treasure. How many men? Bradford called back to Santos, his military training immediately asserting itself as he began evaluating the tactical situation they were facing. The elderly Mexican's response sent a chill through everyone present. At least 50 riders in the main column, with advanced scouts spreading out to surround the ranch. They're armed with military weapons and moving with the coordination of professional soldiers rather than common bandits. Clara May felt her carefully constructed plan beginning to crumble as she realized that involving the territorial authorities might have been too little. Too late to prevent the violence that was now descending upon Bitter Creek Ranch. The federal marshals were still days away, and the Revolutionary Army that had been attracted by the promise of substantial treasure would not be deterred by threats of future legal consequences. Bradford moved away from the window and began checking his weapons with the systematic efficiency of someone who had faced similar situations many times before. Miss Henderson, he said, his tone becoming businesslike rather than threatening. Our personal differences are now irrelevant. General Valdez and his revolutionaries will kill everyone on this ranch and burn the buildings to cover their tracks. Our only chance of survival is to work together until this immediate threat is eliminated. Catherine Moreau nodded grimly, producing a small but deadly-looking pistol from her jacket and checking its ammunition with practiced movements. Bradford is right, Mrs. Henderson. Valdez's reputation for brutality exceeds even the colonel's, and his revolutionary goals make him far more dangerous than simple treasure hunters who might be satisfied with acquiring wealth and departing. Clara May understood that she was facing exactly the kind of situation that her grandfather had feared most. with multiple groups of armed criminals converging on the ranch, while she possessed knowledge that each group would kill to obtain. But rather than paralyzing her with fear, the approach of immediate danger seemed to clarify her thoughts and strengthen her resolve to see her plan through to its conclusion. "Santos," she called out to the concealed Mexican horse trainer, "can you get a message to Marshal Thompson in Helena? Tell him that General Valdez and his Revolutionary Army are attacking American citizens on territorial soil, and that immediate military intervention is required to prevent an international incident." Taquido, Old Mexican, nodded and disappeared toward the back of the barn, where Clara May knew he kept a fast horse ready for exactly such emergencies. His departure left the three former enemies alone in the ranch house, united by the approaching threat, but still fundamentally opposed in their ultimate objectives regarding the treasure that had brought them all together. The sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder as the fleeing scouts reached the ranch yard, their horses stumbling with exhaustion as the riders threw themselves from their saddles and sought cover behind the various outbuildings. The pursuing Revolutionary Army appeared moments later, spreading out in a coordinated pattern that revealed their military training and professional capabilities. General Marcus Valdez himself was easily identifiable among the mounted revolutionaries, his ornate uniform and commanding presence marking him as a leader who expected absolute obedience from his followers. When he called out toward the ranch house, his voice carried the authority of someone who was accustomed to having his demands met without question or delay. "People of the Henderson Ranch," Valdez announced in accented but clear English, "you are surrounded by soldiers of the Army of Liberation, fighting to overthrow the corrupt governments that oppress the people of Mexico and the American territories. We have come to claim treasure that will fund our revolutionary activities, and we will obtain this treasure through negotiation or through force, as circumstances require." Clara May felt a surge of anger at the revolutionary general's casual assumption that he could simply take whatever he wanted from American citizens on American soil, using political rhetoric to justify what was essentially armed robbery on a massive scale. Her response was delivered in a voice that carried across the ranch yard with surprising strength and authority. "General Valdez, this is Clara May Henderson, and you are trespassing on American territory while threatening American citizens. The treasure you seek is already under federal protection, and attacking this ranch will bring the full force of the United States military down upon you and your revolutionary organization." Valdez's laugh was genuinely amused, as if he found Clara May's defiance entertaining rather than threatening. "Senora Henderson, your government cannot protect you from forces that operate beyond the reach of territorial law enforcement. My army has crossed borders that your federal marshals dare not approach, and we will complete our mission regardless of the consequences that may follow." The general's confidence was based on more than simple bravado, Clara May realized. Revolutionary organizations, like Valdez's army, operated in the shadowy areas between national jurisdictions, using political rhetoric to justify criminal activities while avoiding direct confrontation with major military forces that could destroy them in open battle. But Clara May had one final card to play, a revelation that would change the entire dynamic of the situation and force all the competing parties to reconsider their assumptions about the treasure they were fighting to claim. The information had been hidden in the final pages of her grandfather's confession, details that she had not shared with Catherine Moreau or Colonel Bradford, because they represented the most dangerous secret of all. "General Valdez," she called out, hoping that her voice would not betray the fear that was threatening to overwhelm her carefully maintained composure. "Before you commit your men to an attack that will accomplish nothing except their deaths, you should know that The treasure you seek no longer exists in the location where it was originally hidden. The announcement created a moment of stunned silence among all the armed groups surrounding the ranch. As the implications of Clara May's words began to penetrate minds that had been focused entirely on the mechanics of claiming wealth that might no longer be available for claiming. My grandfather retrieved the James Gang silver 3 years ago and used it to establish a scholarship fund for war orphans administered through churches in Missouri and administered by people who have no knowledge of the money's criminal origins. The treasure you're fighting for has already been converted into legitimate charitable activities that benefit the innocent victims of violence like what you're planning here today. The revelation was only partially true, but it contained enough accuracy to be convincing while serving Clara May's ultimate objective of preventing the stolen silver from enriching criminals who would use it to fund additional violence and suffering. Ezekiel Henderson had indeed made substantial anonymous donations to various charitable organizations during his final years, though Clara May was not certain about the exact amounts or whether he had used treasure money for these purposes. More importantly, her announcement created doubt and confusion among the various armed groups, forcing them to question whether the prize they were fighting for actually existed and whether the risks they were taking were justified by the potential rewards. Revolutionary armies and treasure-hunting expeditions both depended on the promise of substantial financial gain to maintain the loyalty and motivation of their followers. Bradford was the first to respond to Clara May's announcement, his military experience, allowing him to recognize the tactical implications of her revelation more quickly than the other combatants. If the treasure has already been dispersed, he called out to General Valdez, then this entire operation has been based on false information. There's no point in risking your men's lives for wealth that no longer exists. But Valdez was too experienced a leader to accept such claims without verification, and his response revealed the calculating intelligence that had allowed him to build a successful revolutionary organization. Perhaps the treasure has been moved, Senora Henderson, but you would not have remained at this ranch if you possessed no knowledge of valuable assets that could be claimed. My army will search every building and interview every person until we determine the truth about your family's criminal legacy. The sound of distant gunfire from the direction of the main road interrupted Valdez's threats, suggesting that additional forces were approaching the ranch and engaging with the Revolutionary Army's rear guard. Clara May felt a surge of hope as she realized that Miguel Santos had succeeded in reaching the territorial authorities, and that federal marshals or military units were arriving to confront the international criminals who had invaded American territory. Santos appeared at the edge of the ranch yard, riding hard from the direction of the main road, with news that would transform the entire situation once again. Marshal Thompson has arrived with 20 federal deputies and a company of cavalry from Fort Harrison, he shouted across the yard. General Valdez and his Revolutionary Army are now surrounded by United States military forces, and surrender is their only option for avoiding complete destruction. The news created immediate chaos among the revolutionary forces, as mounted soldiers who had been preparing to attack the ranch buildings suddenly found themselves caught between their target and a superior military force that could destroy them in open battle. Valdez's confident bearing wavered as he realized that his careful planning had been undermined by the rapid response of American authorities. Clara May seized the moment of confusion to deliver a final message that would determine how the confrontation resolved itself and whether the violence that had threatened her family's legacy would finally come to an end. General Valdez, Colonel Tutt, Bradford, Miss Moreau, she called out with authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her own resources. You all came here seeking treasure that was stolen from innocent people 20 years ago. That treasure has now been returned to serve its rightful purpose of helping victims rather than enriching criminals. The approaching sound of military cavalry and the sight of federal marshals taking positions around the ranch perimeter gave weight to Clara May's words and forced all the armed groups to recognize that their criminal conspiracy had been exposed and defeated by someone they had consistently underestimated. "You have one final choice to make," Clara May continued, her voice carrying across the ranch yard with surprising strength. "You can surrender peacefully and face justice through legal channels, or you can fight against overwhelming odds and face destruction that will serve no purpose except to satisfy your own pride and greed." The silence that followed her ultimatum was broken by the sound of weapons being lowered and hands being raised in surrender, as revolutionary soldiers and treasure hunters alike recognized that their criminal enterprise had been defeated not by superior force, but by the moral courage of a woman who had chosen to do what was right rather than what was safe or profitable. As federal marshals moved in to arrest the various criminals who had converged on Bitter Creek Ranch, Clara May felt a profound sense of completion and peace that had been missing from her life since Daniel Morrison's death 5 years earlier. She had finally broken the cycle of violence and secrecy that had haunted her family for 2 decades, choosing truth and justice over the easy compromises that had paralyzed her grandfather for so many years. The treasure that had been the source of so much suffering would indeed be used to help victims of violence, as Clara May had promised, administered through legitimate charitable organizations that could put the stolen silver to work, serving justice rather than enriching criminals. Her grandfather's final wish that the treasure be handled with honor rather than greed had been fulfilled, even though the process had required courage that he had never been able to summon during his own lifetime. 6 months later, Clara May Henderson stood once again in the kitchen of the ranch house that had been the scene of so much drama and danger, but now the space felt peaceful and secure in ways it had never experienced during her grandfather's lifetime. The federal investigation had cleared her of any criminal wrongdoing, while confirming that Ezekiel Henderson's charitable donations had indeed been funded by recovered treasure money, providing legal protection for activities that served justice rather than personal enrichment. Bitter Creek Ranch was operating more successfully than ever before, managed by Clara May with assistance from Miguel Santos and several other employees who had proven their loyalty during the crisis that had nearly destroyed everything. The publicity surrounding the treasure recovery and the defeat of international criminals had attracted favorable attention from territorial authorities, resulting in government contracts and business opportunities that provided sustainable prosperity without dependence on stolen wealth. Most importantly, Clara May had received word that the charitable fund established with her grandfather's treasure money had already begun providing assistance to war orphans and victims of violence throughout the Western Territories, proving that stolen wealth could indeed be transformed into legitimate benefit for innocent people who deserved help rather than further suffering. If this incredible story of courage, family secrets, and choosing what's right over what's easy has moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever faced a situation where doing the right thing seemed impossible, but turned out to be the only choice that could bring real peace? Share your experiences with our community of viewers who believe that moral courage can triumph over even the most dangerous circumstances. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Tomorrow, we have an equally compelling tale about a Civil War nurse who discovered a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government. And next week, we're sharing the incredible story of a frontier teacher who single-handedly stopped a range war through sheer determination and clever thinking. These are stories of ordinary people who chose extraordinary courage when faced with impossible choices, and we think you'll find them as inspiring as Clara May Henderson's triumph over the forces that threatened to destroy everything she loved.